Welcome to the second episode of the Inner Alchemy series. In the first episode, we discussed how we align ourselves with external environment and the currents it carries with it. And in this episode, I would like to talk about how many cultural teachings or community past teachings, sometimes religious teachings, have taught us to learn to discriminate things in reality that we don't find useful or that don't serve us very well. This notion has been taught to us culturally across many various myths and narratives that come to us from different cultures, different religions, different backgrounds. A very prominent example can be found in Cinderella, which has over 200 different variations across different cultures, where Cinderella has to sort the grains from the rice. This element also appears in myths like Psyche and Eros, as well as the old Russian myth of Vasilisa the Beautiful, where female characters have to sit down and separate small objects from other objects. Depending on the myth variation, the objects change based on what culturally is more appropriate in the region, but the theme that you need to be able to divide Popeyes from dirt, or in one myth somewhere in Asia, I don't quite recall which one, there was you need to separate the fish from the milk. But the idea of sorting and the idea of having the ability to separate is what matters, because it tests how the young woman usually is capable to differentiate one thing from another. And it seems like a relatively simple task if you listen to those fairy tales in a very literal manner, but when you think about them in a more metaphorical sense, the ability in reality to separate one thing from another can also be seen thematically in formulations like not everything that glitters is gold, right? So we are culturally taught to learn to differentiate what actually matters versus what doesn't. This theme repeats itself in more pop culture prominent movies like Coraline, where this character, who also happens to be a female, enters another realm where her other mother creates a world of illusions that she has to navigate in order to save her parents, and she receives a gift of a stone through which she can look and see what is real and what is not an illusion. So this topic and this theme of being able to perceive what matters, what is not an illusion to you, is also cross-cultural wisdom that our ancestors tried to pass on to us in the form of stories and narratives, and help us navigate the world where the currents, regardless of their new physical appearance, remain the same in essence, that there are deceptions, there are illusions, but the things that truly matter are hidden and disguised within this material realm. So those fairy tales give us a hint about where that power to sort and differentiate illusions from what matters comes from. It's common for these myths to have some magical character or magical force to help the female heroine to resolve the task at hand. In the case of Cinderella, it was the godmother. In the case of Vasilisa the Great, it was the doll that helped her, that was given to her by her mother. And I think there is a notable importance in the female nature of these forces. As these myths take place in the metaphorical, abstract arena of the mind, they are not literal in what they communicate, So when we see that it is a female force, both the main character and a godmother or a mother that passed on something, it is meant to represent the hereditary female wisdom, which can be passed on to both males and females alike. It is meant to represent the intuition and the fluidity which is traditionally associated with femininity that is necessary for that sorting. I would assume that when these stories were written, the notion of femininity was associated with emotionality, being in tune with your rhythms and cycles, and being aware of your intuition and wisdom. There is a male-oriented analogy to this force, which is prominently seen in knights in shining armor slaying a dragon with the sword. Sword being the sharper, more physically executive force that enacts change into the narrative and reality. The sword has been traditionally viewed as a tool for enacting clarity and cutting off the pieces and the parts that are not necessary or no longer serve in the narrative. And often swords are used to slay in the mental arena of the mind, say the dragons that no longer be there or stand in the way of the goal. Even in Christian texts, you can see that cherubim, the angels prescribed by God to guard heaven, use flaming swords to protect it. So the sword there as well serves as something that cuts off the unworthy parts with the fire element, illustrating burning, so a more radical version of just pure clarity and truth alone. And in today's culture, when we look at things like tarot, swords again represent air, intuition, clarity, potentially truth, and communicate to us the symbol of cutting off what no longer should be there. This is the essence of the beauty of the abstract, metaphorical, magical worlds that we are exposed to since we are little, because often it's really hard to illustrate certain currents in reality, especially for people across time who did not have schools or did not have textbooks, but they will always have stories, and they will watch Disney movies or listen to their parents tell them stories from different distant worlds. And those stories carry those currents that we subconsciously embed into our reality as instruction manuals for how to interact with reality, without often even recognizing that those currents are being embedded in us. And this example of learning to sort and discriminate what no longer serves your reality is a very, very prominent part of many narratives that emerge along with adulthood and life experience. And using representations like the sword can illustrate the complex nature that sometimes cutting off those parts might not be a pleasant experience and might be a battle, like when you have to slay a certain dragon. And the value of these stories having such explicit shapes in the mythical world is you can see how those concepts and those currents are illustrated. You can pinpoint them, understand them, and learn from them without trying to explain what they are, because ultimately their nature is extremely hard to describe, and yet they arise in different cultures and different societies over and over again across generations. And despite of technological advancements, the reemergence of those currents, as long as there are people who are capable to sort them, will continue. And that's where the value of learning to identify those currents in narratives that surround us and learning to implement them because they were already introduced to you once in your life before. You might have not picked up fully on what they were trying to tell you, but this might be a good time to put your awareness to the idea that you have the power to sort and discriminate from everything that your external environment tells you should matter, and find what matters to you, what truly matters. And it's a personal journey of identifying your own truth and knowing yourself. Thank you for joining the Inner Alchemy series, Episode 2.